Over the past 3 years, the Doctor Who series had undergone a dramatic reshuffle. Under the stewardship of Carnival Films, the show had been modernised for audiences of the 90s, with a more modern runtime and a younger actor in the lead role. Season 33 had been a success for the current production team, with Hugh Bonneville proving to be a likeable Doctor. And as 1 year closed, another year began, with work soon commencing on Bonneville's second year, Season 34.
Doctor Who, The Cancelled Years.
Season 34 of Doctor Who would have starred Hugh Bonneville as the 9th Doctor, along with Beverly Cressman as Abigail Norwood. It would also see Stephen Garwood acting as producer, with Gary Russell as script editor. Season 34 would see the debut of a new script editor, Gary Russell, who was suggested to Garwood by Colin Brake. It would also be the final season for Stephen Garwood as producer, as he'd been offered the role of producer on EastEnders. Replacing Garwood in Season 35 would be Lynn Grant, who, like Garwood, had progressed up the production ladder from assistant floor manager to production manager. For this season, Garwood commissioned the construction of a new TARDIS set, as he felt it was time to finally retire the 1983 console, which was starting to look really outdated by 1997. Inspired by the set of American sci-fi shows, notably the set of more recent Star Trek starships, the new TARDIS interior was designed to feel more akin to the bridge of a ship, with a more metallic design, while still retaining the basic design elements of a TARDIS interior, such as the console in the centre and around all walls. Season 34 would air between the 5th of July 1997 and the 20th of September 1997. It would consist of 12 episodes across 7 stories, with 2 single-parters and 5 two-parters, and would go out weekly on Saturday night. This story sees the Doctor taking Abigail to an artificial planet named Mikabawa's World in the year 3999 to see the Intergalactic Olympics, which is the same as the Earth Olympics, but on an intergalactic scale. However, the Doctor soon finds himself wrapped in a mystery after discovering reports of security guards going missing underneath the stadium. The story sees the Doctor and Abigail investigating a missing security case, as well as investigating a new performance-enhancing drug that is being used by some of the athletes. It turns out that the Wirren are responsible for both mysteries. The Doctor finds that the security were kidnapped by the Wirren and were being converted into Wirren. He also discovers that the Wirren developed the drug, which is actually designed to eventually turn the athletes into Wirren, and the Wirren plan to spread the drug through the universe. However, the Wirren are eventually defeated when the Doctor creates an antidote drug, which stops the athletes from being converted into Wirren, although the athletes will be permanently damaged from the experience and will never recover. This story begins with the Doctor receiving a call from Leela on Gallifrey, who tells the Doctor that something is wrong with Romana. She's become more isolated and not like herself at all. She also explains that the entire council has recently changed after the entirety of the old one were assassinated. She says that apparently each new member of the council has a somewhat sketchy past, and that Romana has been making decisions which go against what she had previously stood for as president. Realising that something must be up, the Doctor sets course to Gallifrey in order to investigate. We see the Doctor testing Romana by casually talking with her, as well as learning more about the new council in order to determine whether Romana has been compromised in some way. We see that the council is slowly but surely turning Gallifrey into a dictatorship, with posters that glamorise the current government and very harsh punishments for minute crimes. As the Doctor continues testing Romana, Leela and Abigail find themselves helping a squad of guards, led by Leela's husband, Andred, to capture an escaped cryogenic prisoner known as Prisoner 672. And while searching on their own, Leela and Abigail find Prisoner 672, a Time Lady played by Chloe Annette. The prisoner begs the two of them to not hand them over, and that she's being framed for something. She says she doesn't know who she is, but she swears she is not the real Prisoner 672. Abigail says she believes 672, and so Leela and Abigail take her to Leela's quarters. Meanwhile, we see the Doctor continuing to test Romana in her office. Suddenly, the office is breached by a Time Lord guard wielding a Staser rifle, the Assassin. The Doctor attempts to overthrow the assassin, but is knocked out and thrown to the ground. The assassin swings his arm back up to shoot Romana, before he's shot down by Romana, who's revealed to be in possession of her own staser. The room is then swarmed by a group of guards, who make sure Romana is unharmed. However, when asked what happened, Romana says the Doctor, who's now awaking from his coma, is the assassin. The Doctor tries to claim his innocence, yet Romana swears and insists he is Gallifrey's #1 enemy and has sentenced him to death. Back in Leela's quarters, the group hear an announcement over the intercom, with Romana telling the people of Gallifrey that the Doctor is to be executed. Whilst Leela and Abigail state that this can't be right, 672 is taken back by Romana's voice, claiming that it's her voice. Leela and Abigail are confused as to what 672 means, believing that she mustn't be well. But then 672 says that she's starting to remember who she was. She is Romana, and the woman currently acting as president is not the real Romana. She says she has vague memories of being attacked and a sharp deadly pain in her back, before being forced to take the place of prisoner 672. In order to determine whether this woman really is Romana, Leela throws some personal questions at her, which she gets right. She and Abigail then take a sample of her DNA to test, which fully confirms that this woman is indeed Romana. But then that begs the question, if this is Romana, then who is President of Gallifrey? After convincing Andred and his guards to stand down and that the President may be a fake, the group make their way to the security logs to find out who exactly imprisoned the real Romana. The group find the footage of Romana having her neck snapped and placed into cryogenic stasis, but find that the real assassin is using a perception blur to cover their identity on the footage. Romana uses her clearance to understand the assassin's identity, and we see the assassin to be none other than Colleen. The group continue to see through more security footage, where they're eventually able to create a full timeline of events. It's revealed that a year ago, Colleen escaped from her imprisonment, where she proceeded to kill Romana and imprison her in her place. She then obtained an ancient elixir named the Elixir of Rejuvenation, which allowed her to regenerate into any form she wished. She chose to regenerate into the form of Romana and took her place as president. She then proceeded to have Romana's High Council killed off and have them replaced with people that would be able to help her in her ultimate goal, to have full control over the people of Gallifrey. With all the evidence gathered, the group rushes to the execution chamber, where they're able to save the Doctor just in the nick of time. Romana then exposes Colleen to their guards and shows them the evidence. Romana orders her men to have Colleen restrained, however Colleen uses a device on her arm and teleports away. We then see the Doctor leading the group through the corridors of Gallifrey as they attempt to track down Colleen. They eventually trace her down to an old workshop, where they find Colleen attempting to escape in the Type 80 TARDIS. However, the Doctor fully raises the transduction barrier and brings the TARDIS back down. The story then ends with Romana sentencing Colleen to eternal imprisonment, as she is to be sealed within a dwarf star alloy chamber, a room that exists outside of time and space itself. Romana then thanks the Doctor for his assistance before he and Abigail return to the TARDIS. This story sees the Doctor arriving in San Francisco in 1997, where he becomes aware of a group of vampires living on Earth in an abandoned theatre. However, these vampires don't wish to conquer Earth and instead live normal lives, but due to them being vampires, they do feed off human blood, resulting in the deaths of 200 homeless people. Being a Time Lord, the Doctor has a natural duty to wipe out the vampires. However, wishing to find a peaceful solution, as well as not wanting the Time Lords to find out about the presence of vampires, which could result in San Francisco being wiped out, the Doctor agrees to work with the leader of the local vampire coven, a vampire lady from the year 1087 named Joanna Harris, to try and develop an artificial food source so they don't have to kill to survive. Harris admits that she's also been working along similar lines for some time, but she isn't too sure whether she can trust the Doctor. So, in order to assure mutual cooperation, the Doctor and Harris undergo a blood fastening, which establishes a psychic link that will cause each to suffer any injuries inflicted upon the other, up to and including death. The story sees the Doctor working with Harris and both Unit North America, led by Brigadier General Adrian Kramer, to try and make peace with the vampires, as well as helping to develop a kill-free food source. However, a vampire named Slake, who first agreed to become a vampire for the dark romance of it, gets angry at Harris for trying to end the hunt. Wishing for the bloodshed to continue, Slake begins to stir up the younger vampires with visions of a life beyond mortality and attempts to provoke a war. Slake then takes command of the younger vampires and orders them to begin attacking the humans. When the Doctor and Harris learn about Slake's attacks, they realise that they have no choice but to fight back. They then develop a repellent which, when ingested by vampires, will kill them stone dead. We see the Doctor, Abigail and Harris travelling to the abandoned theatre to wipe out the vampires. However, their plans are foiled when Slake takes Abigail as a hostage. The Doctor then meets with Slake, who sacrifices his life to save Abigail. Slake agrees to free Abigail, and he, along with the rest of the vampires, begin feeding off the Doctor's blood. However, as the vampires begin to feed off the Doctor's blood, they begin to keel over and die. The Doctor, claiming to be dying, then asks Harris to convert him into a vampire. Harris then also begins consuming the Doctor's blood, where it's revealed that the Doctor ingested a sample of the vampire repellent, which killed Slake's army, and then kills Harris. However, after Harris dies, the Doctor revives her using CPR, where he reveals that although the vampire factor in his cells have been destroyed, the blood fastening enabled her to survive as a human. The story then ends with Adrian Kramer offering Harris a chance to work for UNIT, and the Doctor and Abigail departing in the TARDIS. This story sees the Doctor and Abigail landing on the starship Frost, a luxury cruise ship for deep space vacations. Immediately after realising they're on a cruise ship, Abigail suddenly decides that they could do with a vacation and wishes to stay on board and take a holiday. We initially see the Doctor and Abigail exploring the ship to see what it offers, which includes a giant swimming pool room, fine dining restaurants, top-of-the-range leisure activity simulations, and luxurious bedrooms. They also take time to meet with the rest of the passengers, including a young human couple named Amelia and William, a space researcher named Ivan, and an elderly rich couple named Judy and Frank. Everything seems to be going well and relaxing at first, until the Doctor and Abigail are discovered by the captain of the ship, Bowman, who believes them to be stowaways and plans to have them locked up. Suddenly, the starship is shaken violently and the automatic alarms are raised, alerting everyone of a breach in the observation deck. The Doctor is able to seal the hole, but not before the ship's power is drained and the lights go out, leaving only a few emergency lights. Bowman tells the passengers that an automatic SOS will have been sent out and asks for everyone to return to their rooms whilst he deals with the Doctor and Abigail. As we see the Doctor and Abigail being thrown into jail, we cut to Amelia and William returning to their room. Suddenly a blue wisp flies down the corridor and crashes into Amelia. We see her eyes turning an electric light blue colour before she emits an ear-piercing scream which slowly begins to kill William. The sound of the scream echoes through the entire ship, and everyone rushes to the scene, with the Doctor and Abigail breaking out of jail to investigate. The story would then evolve into a typical Base Under Siege-esque story, with the entire cast hunting down Amelia, who the Doctor discovers to be possessed by a space entity he's unfamiliar with, as well as trying to find a way to defeat this entity, and, if possible, somehow save Amelia. Throughout this story, we'd get to learn more about this entity, as the entity communicates with the cast, as well as possible theories for its motives. We learn that the entity entered the ship through the breach, after swimming through empty space for decades. It can possess anyone, and has the power to kill anyone using a high-frequency scream, which destroys the brain cells. We also learn that it has the ability to swap bodies at ease, as we see it possess Amelia, Ivan, and even Bowman. We never get to learn what the entity is or what it wants, but the Doctor theorises that it knows about the SOS and that it must be planning to escape to the nearest civilization and cause havoc. Eventually, however, the entity is defeated when the Doctor traps the entity in an emergency stasis chamber and freezes it. The story then ends with the Doctor and Abigail making sure the survivors are okay before they quickly leave in the TARDIS, just as the SOS team begins to arrive. This story sees the Doctor arriving in London in the year 1930 in order to return some old library books. However, before the Doctor can leave, the TARDIS warns the Doctor about the presence of a time-warmed Kronos in the atmosphere, meaning there is an unshielded time corridor somewhere in the vicinity. This leads the Doctor to investigate this potential threat, where he sees Heath Portis, a well-known seismologist, being kidnapped by a woman named Julia. However, before the Doctor can catch Julia, the entire city begins to rumble and shake, something which the Doctor knows isn't right. The story then sees the Doctor and Abigail trying to find out why Porteous was kidnapped, as well as the cause for the trembles in the time corridor, which the Doctor suspects is all connected in some way. It turns out that a creature of gas known as Zodal is responsible, a criminal from a distant planet who had imprinted his mind into a cloud of radium. We learn that Zodal has possessed a millionaire known as Helpworth, who is responsible for the kidnapping of Portis. Zodal is planning on forcing Portis to program a seismic simulator which could destroy the Earth. He then plans to channel the power of its destruction so that he could imprint himself permanently onto a new host. Eventually, however, Zodal is defeated when the Doctor forces his ship to take off after sabotaging his equipment. Helpworth also chooses to commit suicide before Zodal can take control, which leaves Zodal drifting helplessly through space. This story sees the Doctor being summoned to Earth by Winfred Bambera on the 31st of December 1999. She explains to the Doctor that at midnight this day, every single piece of technology transmitted a message to the human race, which read, "The end of days are here." Since then, most if not all technology has failed to work, with everyone cut off from the rest of the world. No one has any idea what this means, who's causing this, or why, but Bambera believes this has something to do with the turn of the millennium, and may be related to the Y2K bug, a scare amongst the population that all technology would break down at the start of the year 2000. The story would see the Doctor and Abigail working with Bambera to try and track down the source of this transmission using very primitive technology, whilst also trying to work out a way to restore all technology on Earth. They eventually discover that a race of aliens known as the Cytrons are responsible, creatures that are made out of glass and feed off electricity. The Doctor discovers that the Cytrons plan to conquer the Earth by first cutting off all communications across the planet, which would throw the Earth into a state of panic. Then, arising from the smoke, the Cytrons would be able to invade and conquer the planet with ease. However, the Cytrons are defeated when the Doctor restores Earth's technology by draining energy from their ship. This, however, results in the death of the Cytrons, as without electricity, the Cytrons simply die out and collapse to the ground, shattering into tiny shards of glass. The story then ends with Bambera thanking the Doctor for his help, with the Doctor and Abigail celebrating the turn of the millennium in London. Before moving on, credit must go to the Dalek Hunter, who originally devised this story and allowed us to use it in cancelled years. This story sees the Doctor and Abigail arriving in what they expect to be London in the year 2109. However, upon exiting the TARDIS, they find themselves on what appears to be an alien world named Paratraxis. Furthermore, the planet is inhabited by horse-like aliens named the Tractites. However, to the Doctor's horror, he discovers that Paratraxis is Earth. Something or someone has changed the timelines. Through some investigation, he finds that somehow the Tractites travelled back in time and came to Earth at some point when mankind was still evolving and wiped out the population, taking the planet as their own. Now in the year 2109, Paratraxis is home to the Tractites, a much more peaceful and civilized race than any form of human civilization. Feeling conflicted about what he must do next, but realizing the dangers of the timeline, the Doctor realizes he has no choice but to find the point of historical divergence and correct it. The story then sees the Doctor travelling through time in order to work out when, how and why the Tractites took over Earth. we learn that in the far future, the human empire invaded and nearly wiped out the entire Tractite race on their original home planet. However, the survivors of the bloodshed came into possession of a time tree, a tree which enabled time travel to a random point in history simply by plucking its seeds. The Tractites then used the time tree to travel to the dawn of human history to establish a colony and prevent the human race from ever evolving. However, one of the survivors, named Garville, ended up in the 20th century, where he worked with a mad unit soldier named Jacob Hines to test and develop a virus which could wipe out the human race. The story would see the Doctor and Abigail working with a Tractite named Katig, who comes to realise that their timeline and existence must end to stop the virus from spreading, as well as stopping Morvril, a survivor of the Tractite genocide who is now a leader, from wiping out the human race. Eventually, Hines is injected with the virus himself, which ultimately kills him. Morville's plans are eventually foiled, but the Doctor offers her the chance to start again, to let him use the TARDIS and help her people find a new world where they can start afresh. However, to the Doctor's horror, Morville and the rest of the Tractites are wiped out by a Tractite laser cannon by one of the supporting characters, with the Doctor left unsure whether the cannon was used accidentally or maliciously. Season 34 was considered a successful season, but was considered a little underwhelming compared to Season 33. Whilst people continue to praise Bonneville, Cressman and most of the stories this year, many felt that there wasn't anything too special or massively standout about this season. And so 1997 came to a close, and so did the tenure of Stephen Garwood. And with Lynn Grant taking over as producer, work soon commenced on the following season, Doctor Who's 35th anniversary.